This is Glenn Lansbury, a legendary swordsman of old. I know, seeing him working as a garbage collector doesn't exactly scream legend. But here's the thing, 10 years ago, a great sage brought a breakthrough to magic technology, one that boosted the power of mages exponentially. With that new power, the Demon King was defeated and peace finally arrived. But for swordsmen, who used to be the heart of every battle, the story played out very differently. With nothing left to do, Glenn ended up helping folks out with everyday manual labor, including this little old lady who walks up to him and tells him she'll forever be in his debt. That's when he explains that he inherited the position of royal sword instructor from his late father. But now, since this is the age of magic, he feels it's his duty to help others. Thanks to the magic revolution, mages gained overwhelming power, and combat, once dominated by warriors, now belonged entirely to them. Status, honor, and power, which had once belonged to warriors, were taken over by mages, and he who had lived only for the blade lost almost everything. To make things worse, he injured his leg and can no longer wield a sword like he used to. The old woman tells him not to be so hard on himself, but the poor guy insists that, as an unemployed man, he's the one who should be thanking her for the work. He who was once known as the sword saint now scrapes by on odd jobs. Apologizing for how little it is, she pays him for the job. He asks if that's all for today, but she says no, and that she needs to take care of something at the academy. Well, this is the Royal Academy of Magic, a place of magical learning, whose owner was his childhood friend, the great sage. Thanks to that sage, Glenn is able to make a living doing tasks like picking up garbage. That's when, out of nowhere, he hears a voice crying for help. He's startled, wondering if he's just hearing things. As he gets closer, he sees 3 students complaining about some disgusting, foul-smelling thing they had summoned. One of them yells that the scumbag who sold him the scales of the ancient holy dragon ripped him off. Furious, he says he isn't going to let it slide and stomps on the creature. His friend shows him that he measured the creature's mana, and the reading was only 3, a ridiculously low number, since even weak familiars usually have tens of thousands. His friends ask if he's going to form a contract with that thing, and he answers, disgusted, that there's no way. Since a normal mage can only form a contract with a single familiar in their entire life, weak spirits have no value to him. Meanwhile, Glenn watches everything from a distance. This kind of contract is what gives mages an amount of mana that far surpasses their own personal limits. But the power boost depends on the strength of the summoned spirit. Furious over the failed summoning, the boy starts crushing the little creature under his boot. Well, Glenn is certain he heard the creature's voice begging for help. That's when the young man kicks the little thing away, demanding that it shut up, but then the spell backfires, and the rich kid starts screaming, because the lizard's shell was tougher than stone. The others try beating the creature with pieces of wood, but the branches snap against its absurd resistance. That's when the leader of the group steps up and tells his friends to get out of the way. He warns them that, since they aren't going to form a contract, he's going to blast that disgusting thing apart with his magic. Watching the boy prepare the spell, Glenn can't just stand by. He steps in front of the attack and tells the young men to knock off the cowardly behavior. But the boy tells the older man to get out of his way, saying he's simply taking responsibility for his own summon. Glenn refuses to back down, though, arguing that there are strict rules and conditions for sacrificing a spirit. But the little punk makes a point of reminding him that he belongs to the nobility of this kingdom. He asks if a humble laborer really has the guts to defy a noble. His friends start jeering, saying that swordsmen have become nothing but useless, dead weight since the magic revolution. With that, the boy conjures a massive, razor-sharp crystal above his head, threatening to force Glenn out of the way. He promises he won't kill him to avoid trouble, but warns that a mere warrior can't do a thing against magic. Firing the giant crystal, he swears he'll only tear off Glenn's arm. The bastard tells Glenn to regret ever butting into something that wasn't his business. But in a split second, Glenn's sword flashes through the air in a perfect, devastating cut. And before they can even react, the blade is already at the leader's throat. With total cold-bloodedness, the former sword saint informs him that he himself will take responsibility for looking after the spirit. And with a menacing look, he politely suggests the boy get the hell out of there right now. His friends could barely wrap their heads around how a mere human just pulled that off. Suddenly, a gigantic wolf appears out of nowhere, letting out a deafening roar that throws the other students to the ground. Glenn feels the beast's immense mana just as he hears a female voice calling out to him from a distance. This is Lil Pelissier, the top student at the academy, who runs over asking if he's all right. But before Glenn can answer, the spoiled noble asks if she really thinks he'll get away with this. But Lil isn't intimidated, and she lists his crimes, warning that any one of them alone is grounds for immediate expulsion. Completely out of his mind, the rich kid screams that he doesn't care about her threats, and he even mocks the girl, promising she and the sword swordsman will regret ever standing up to a noble. But his tough guy act crumbles the instant the enormous wolf lets out a roar right behind him. Lil asks her wolf to take those troublemakers straight to the principal's office. And so, Faril bites down on the boys' capes and drags them off like they're nothing but trash. Alone with Glenn, Lil bows politely and apologizes for the whole ordeal. Glenn compliments the beast, calling her an incredible familiar, but she quickly corrects him, saying Faril isn't her familiar. She's not a mere servant, but a companion with equal rights. Hearing that, Glenn smiles and apologizes for his lack of manners. But suddenly, his injured leg gives out and the poor guy nearly collapses to the ground. Despite the pain, he says he's fine and kneels down before the little spirit. A short time later, they take shelter in one of the private rooms at the Magic Academy. Very carefully, they begin treating the little creature's wounds, applying medicine and ointment. Lil comments that the little spirit is being very well behaved, but curiosity gets the better of her, and she asks how Glenn managed to cut through a magic spell earlier. She explains that while raw mana is invisible, once it becomes a spell, it takes on a physical form. And Glenn says that, for someone who lived by the sword, cutting something like that is as easy as slicing an arrow out of the air. Our hero finishes bandaging the little creature and thanks the girl for the bandages and her help. That's when Lil asks what they should do with the spirit now. The girl says that even if they force the headmaster to accept it, no good would come of it. That's when Glenn makes a decision and asks if he can keep the spirit under his protection. Lil is surprised by the offer, since he isn't a mage after all, but Glenn says he simply can't ignore the little one. Lil explains that there's no problem at all with someone who isn't a mage caring for a spirit creature. However, she gets a little awkward and warns him that keeping a spirit costs a fair amount of money. Glenn asks how much it would be, and when he learns it would be a third of his income, he accepts without hesitation. Hearing that, Lil celebrates, saying the little one is going to love the news. Then the girl asks to walk with him back to his place. When they arrive, Lil says she also wants to help him with the adoption paperwork. In Glenn's arms, the little spirit starts trembling badly. The girl notices the creature's fear and comments that she senses the little one's mana level is extremely low. Because of this, she suggests he be extra careful until the door opens and a beautiful long-haired elf steps in with total elegance. Well, this is Miss Ondine. Glenn asks if the two of them know each other, and the elf explains that Lil is the top student at the Magic Academy. Ondine praises Lil's excellent work, which leaves the young student blushing bright red. After all, the elf is none other than the Spirit King of Water, and she was personally hired by the Academy's headmaster. Lil can't believe that her hero is on such familiar terms with a legendary deity like that. Glenn asks if she came to see the little one, and the elf confirms that she did. But right after, she confesses that the real reason for her visit was that she missed him. Our guy breaks into a smile and answers that he's also very happy to see Ondine. Yeah, I think we all know where this is heading. The elf then changes the subject and apologizes for the awful behavior of the Academy's students. But Glenn tells her she doesn't need to apologize, since he wasn't hurt, and the little one is safe now. The elf agrees and gently pets the spirit's head. Glenn then asks what happened to the students who were mistreating the little creature. With a severe look, Ondine reveals that she banned them for life from ever forming contracts with any spirit. Lil comments that mistreating spirits is an extremely serious crime. The elf then says she has something much more important to discuss. She reveals that the little creature is under a terrible curse. She explains that this curse is consuming all of the little one's mana, leaving it so weak that it could die at any moment. Glenn asks if they can't save it with magic, but Ondine says magic doesn't work against complex curses. Lil adds to the explanation, reminding him that magic and curses are things of completely different natures. Ondine says that praying to benevolent gods brings healing, while praying to malevolent gods brings devastating curses. Lil suggests asking the church to purify the little one, but the elf warns that the spell is too powerful for ordinary priests. Glenn starts to despair, thinking there's no way to save it, but the elf calms him down, assuring him that not all is lost. She reveals that, mysteriously, being close to Glenn eases the spirit's pain and slows the curse's progress. That's because the compatibility between them is enormous, which is exactly why Glenn was able to hear the creature's cries. But since its energy keeps dropping, the elf takes the initiative and decides that she herself will transfer her own mana. Before she begins, Ondine asks for the spirit's name, and since Glenn doesn't know it, she tells him to pick one. Glenn thinks for a few moments, trying to come up with the perfect name. In his arms, the little creature lets out a very cute sound, waiting for the young man's answer. That's when Glenn asks if she'd like to be called Juju. Finding the name Juju extremely friendly, Ondine approves the choice on the spot. Then the elf prepares to begin the mana transfer. A bright magical light fills the entire room, and in that moment, the pain in Glenn's leg mysteriously disappears. The next day, the sunlight streams through Glenn's humble little house. When she wakes up, Juju appears hopping around, which makes Glenn and Lil incredibly happy. But Ondine appears right behind them and warns that they're not fully out of danger yet. Even so, Glenn smiles and thanks the elf. Lil says she has to leave for the day, but promises to come back tomorrow with food and supplies for them. Ondine then declares that she'll also come every single day to keep feeding magical energy to Juju. Glenn thanks her for her kindness, but the elf adds that, since she'll have to come daily anyway, she should just move into his house, which leaves Glenn a little stunned. Ondine says it'll be fine, but Glenn refuses to accept that, and after a morning full of surprises, the day finally begins to settle down at the swordsman's cabin. Later, Glenn feeds little Juju with a spoon, and besides noticing his leg seems much better, he remembers how kind Lil was and decides he'll thank her later. After they eat, he tells Juju she must be exhausted too, and that it's time for them to get some sleep. And it doesn't take long for Glenn to drift off. The next day, Glenn realizes that taking care of such a young spirit is exactly like taking care of a newborn baby. That's because Juju ended up doing her business right in the middle of the bed, forcing the poor guy to clean everything up before breakfast. Wasting no time, he tosses the dirty sheets into the water. After scrubbing them thoroughly, Glenn hangs the clean sheet on the line in the morning sun. Right then, he notices that his leg has stopped hurting and that the heavy labor doesn't bother him like it used to. He looks at Juju and wonders if this sudden improvement has something to do with the mana she received from Ondine. That's when a familiar voice calls out from behind him, wishing the former sword saint a good morning. It was Lil, who had just arrived with her imposing giant wolf, carrying some papers in her hand. The girl excitedly tells him that the official request for the spirit's protection was approved and that she came to deliver the copy of the document. Glenn apologizes for making her come all the way out there, but she smiles and says she wanted to hand over the paperwork as soon as possible. Hearing the girl's voice, Juju starts hopping around inside her little basket. Lil walks over to the basket and gently pets the little spirit on the head, wishing her a good morning. The wolf for real also comes closer and lets out a friendly growl. Lil comments that the little one looks so much better, and Glenn responds that it's all thanks to Ondine's help the night before. Lil takes the opportunity to ask how exactly a humble swordsman like him knows the legendary goddess of water, but before he can answer, an imposing voice echoes through the yard, and to Lil's shock, the headmaster of the academy, Great Sage Vili, appears alongside Salamandir the Fire King. Vili is a legendary mage who carried out the magic revolution, defeated the Demon King, and has contracts with 4 spirit kings. Lil freezes completely, because why would such an important figure be here of all places? But Glenn acts totally naturally, greeting the headmaster in an extremely casual, familiar way, calling him by his nickname, Viri. He mentions that it's been almost a year since they last saw each other in person. The headmaster apologizes, saying he's been very busy. Wide-eyed, the girl asks if the two of them already knew each other from before. Glenn explains that he and Viri are childhood friends, and that they used to fight side by side in the same party. He comments that his friend hasn't aged a day, and the sage explains it's due to the side effects of his own magic. Our guy also greets Salamandir, saying he looks as strong as ever. Then, the headmaster thanks young Lil for always keeping an eye out and helping the former warrior with his daily tasks. The girl turns bright red and stutters that the great sage's words of praise are far too kind for someone like her. Shortly after, the student politely says her goodbyes to head back to the academy, and Glenn thanks her once again for all her help with little Juju. Inside the house, Glenn tells his friend that Ondine was there the day before caring for the spirit, and the sage says he was already aware of everything. Viri admits he came secretly because Ondine hates it whenever the two of them meet up. Our warrior guesses it must be jealousy, but the sage reveals it's the opposite. She's jealous of others being around Glenn, not of him being around her. Glenn admits he doesn't understand any of this stuff, and his friend jokes that the heart of a maiden is an extremely complex thing. Changing the subject, the sage orders Salamandir to transfer some of his fire mana to help little Juju's recovery. Very carefully, the fire giant's enormous hand touches the spirit's tiny head. He explains that the academy will cover all daily expenses and send spirits over to donate mana until little Juju is fully healed. Glenn mentions that Ondine promised to come every day, and Viri answers that if she's ever busy, another spirit will be sent in her place. The young man then asks Viri to drop by more often, even without a special reason, and the sage accepts the invitation, a bit melancholic, which leaves our hero pretty confused by the reaction. That's when he confesses that he thought Glenn deeply hated him because of everything that happened in the past. The sage points to Glenn's injured leg, reminding him that the serious injury happened while his friend was trying to protect him in battle. Glenn says he's already told him to forget about it, but Viri keeps blaming himself for not finding a priest skilled enough to heal him. He bitterly recalls the start of the Magic Revolution, a historic event that put an end to the golden age of swordsmen once and for all. The sage confesses that he feels he was the one who robbed Glenn of a brilliant future as the greatest warrior of the kingdom. But Glenn cuts him off. To prove his point, the young man asks his friend to look around and pay close attention to the details of that simple cabin. He points to the magic stove and to the modern plumbing that instantly delivers hot water throughout the whole house. And he explains that he only lives this comfortably thanks to the technological advances the magic revolution brought. He remembers when they were young and how Viri was always incredible. With that, the sage says his goodbyes, saying he'd better leave quickly before Ondine shows up. Viri sincerely advises his friend to take really good care of the little creature. And he says this decision will also be of enormous importance to Glenn himself. As the door closes, Salamander apologizes and explains that the master has his reasons. The giant reveals that the magic revolution and the creation of the contract formulas were not to save the world or for any noble cause, but rather all of it was born from Viri's single, pure desire to defeat Glenn in combat. Glenn asks if he's joking, but the giant assures him it's the truth, and that the master beats himself up over that selfish motive. Then Glenn lets out a sigh and says that, if that's what Viri thinks, he's completely mistaken about the situation. After all, needing a power capable of revolutionizing and changing the entire world just to defeat him is actually a huge honor. With that, Glenn smiles and asks Salamander to tell his master to come visit with nothing weighing on his mind. The giant places a hand on Glenn's head and on little Juju's and promises he'll deliver the message faithfully, and that Viri will be overjoyed to hear those words. Sometime later, everyday life returns to normals in the small village that surrounds the great magic academy of the kingdom. He celebrates that the drainage work in that area is finally completely finished. Just then, an elderly lady walks up and compliments Glenn on his great work. The young man apologizes for not being able to take on any new odd jobs for a while, but the old woman tells him to stop apologizing for everything. She strokes Juju, saying that taking care of the baby is the top priority, and gushes over how cute the exotic little spirit is. The old lady even offers to finish collecting the trash on her own, insisting the young man should go rest. Glenn smiles and says goodbye to the kind old lady. Then he realizes he just did heavy manual labor without feeling any pain in his injured leg, something that would have been impossible before. Looking at Juju, he figures this incredible recovery must be from the pure mana he's been receiving from the little one. Suddenly, a rock flies out of nowhere and grazes right past Glenn's face. He turns around quickly and sees two young guys laughing, with one complaining that his buddy missed on purpose. The leader steps up and calls a startled Juju a piece of disgusting garbage. The bully warns that he's going to hit for real this time, and asks his friend how many hits he thinks Glenn can take. When he throws the rock, our hero moves fast and catches it in the air with just one hand. Before the guy can react, Glenn charges in like lightning and lands a devastating punch square on the coward's nose. Then, with a fast, brutal combination of blows, he sends both troublemakers flying to the ground. Glenn is a little surprised at how easily he knocked out the two thugs. Suddenly, Juju calls out to catch the swordsman's attention. Glenn immediately rushes over and apologizes for scaring her. But the calm doesn't last long, because the bully gets back up, swearing he's going to kill him. Glenn braces for the worst, since he can't fight properly while shielding little Juju in his arms. That's when a delicate hand appears out of nowhere and gently touches a single finger to the crazy guy's forehead. It was Ondine, who was just about to cast a sleep spell, and with that, the delinquent collapses to the ground like a sack of potatoes. With all the calm in the world, the elf suggests that they just hand these idiots straight over to the local guards. The young man asks if she killed them, but Ondine explains that she just used sleep magic to shut those annoying jerks up. Glenn thanks the elf for showing up right at the perfect moment to save them. He praises the spell, saying that knocking them out in the blink of an eye was brilliant, completely flustered by the young man's praise. The elf starts biting her lip. She then decides she'll handle the matter and promises to make those criminals confess to all their other robberies and crimes. Glenn asks how she'll manage that without any proof, and the elf explains she'll use a truth-inducing spell on them. Ondine says it's an advanced spell and that among humans, only Vili can use it. The young man smiles and praises the genius of his childhood friend, wanting his attention. The elf says that she's also extremely useful and impressive. Glenn picks up on the heavy vibe and quickly agrees that she's also a truly spectacular deity. That's when Ondine walks up to Juju and stares at Glenn, waiting for something extra the young man still hasn't done. Getting the hint, Glenn reaches out and gently pets the top of the elf's head. Glenn notices her happiness and wonders if all spirits, just like Juju, simply love getting head pats. That's when an imaginary salamander cuts the young man's joy short, coldly explaining that head pats don't work the same way on all spirits. Glenn changes the subject and asks whether the sudden improvement in his leg has anything to do with the mana Juju received from Ondine, and the elf confirms it, explaining that the compatibility between the two is so strong that if Juju gets healthy, Glenn heals too. With that, our guy asks Ondine if she knows the little one's true identity, and she says she knows the answer, but that for now it's better to keep it a secret for everyone's safety. Before she leaves, she decides to give Juju a little more mana, revealing that that was the real reason for her visit that day. Glenn thanks her, though he can feel the elf is dodging around the true, mysterious nature of his new companion. She advises Glenn to keep Juju pressed close to his body at all times, since being near him helps ease the pain of the curse. And she reveals that, thinking about exactly that, she brought a special gift to help help him care for the little spirit. Shortly after, Glenn is delighted when he puts on a baby carrier, realizing he can now carry Juju and work at the same time. He thanks her enthusiastically, and the elf asks if he really thought the gift would be useful for daily life. Then, she announces that she's going to take the two delinquents away, and refuses Glenn's help because of his injured leg. With unbelievable strength, the elf hoists the two bullies onto her shoulders with total ease. Glenn says goodbye to her and decides to finish up the work quickly so he can head home and wash his clothes, which got completely covered in mud. After that, the two of them head back to the cabin together. Along the way, Juju peeks out of the carrier, which delights Glenn to see her so curious. He's truly grateful to have Juju by his side. The young man promises that the next chance they get, he'll show her the entire city. Glenn knows he scared her earlier with the fight, and he wants to prove to the little one that humans aren't all bad and violent. And so he walks toward his home, longing for calmer, happier days by her side. A little while later, there was Glenn in his cozy cabin, preparing a delicious meal for his new friend. He peels a piece of fruit very carefully, and it doesn't take long for Juju to devour the whole thing. Glenn praises how practical the carrier is and celebrates that his leg is so much better he can now handle any household chore. Little by little, the swordsman and the spirit deepen their bond of friendship through their daily meals together. The next day, Glenn heads out to the nearby forest to practice his daily swordsmanship training. He closes his eyes and focuses, waiting for the exact moment a leaf breaks off from a tree. With superhuman speed, Glenn draws his sword and slices the leaf perfectly in two. Thanks to the baby carrier, even while carrying Juju, he can now fight without any trouble. That's when he runs into Lil and Faril a little further ahead, near a cabin. The young man asks if something happened to Juju, but she explains that the headmaster just asked her to come by. Curious about what Viri wanted with her, Glenn opens the door and warmly invites everyone inside. But when he opens the door, Glenn gets a huge shock when he comes face to face with the sage himself already sitting at the table, sipping tea. Even without fully understanding, the swordsman agrees that he's always very welcome there. Then, the sage steps closer and apologizes for having startled little Juju. Taking the opportunity, Glenn asks why his friend called Pellissier all the way out here, curious whether some serious problem had come up. And the sage suggests they talk it over while enjoying a nice cup of tea. It doesn't take long for everyone to settle around the table. While the conversation flows, little Juju happily nibbles on a piece of boiled egg. That's when Viri changes tone and reveals the real reason for his visit. He wants Glenn to explore and clear a specific dungeon. The sage asks the young man if he remembers Ondine, saying that Juju's condition is extremely worrying. Glenn is surprised to learn that, even after receiving so much energy from the spirits, Juju's mana is still absurdly low for an ordinary spirit. The sage explains that normal spirits typically have tens of thousands of mana, while the rarest ones easily reach millions of power. Because of this, the only real way to save the little creature is to head straight into that dangerous dungeon. Viri reveals that he found a clue to break Juju's curse, but to get it, they need to defeat the powerful monster that lives deep inside that place. The sage says he's been searching for a way to free the little one from the curse for a long time, which leads the swordsman to realize that everything is directly connected to that dungeon. Excited by the possibility, our guy asks if doing all of this will finally be enough to break that terrible curse for good. His friend answers that it might not be a full cure right away, but it will definitely weaken the spell and give them more time to act. With that, Glenn says any improvement is more than enough for him, but Viri quickly warns him that there are certain conditions. The sage explains that the one who defeats the beast must be the cursed one, meaning Glenn and Juju have to do the job alone, or it won't work. Even so, the young man accepts the challenge of facing the danger alongside his little partner, but he wonders if there really won't be a problem with him fighting in her place. And the sage assures him that the strong magical bond between them allows it. His friend says he has complete faith in the strength of the former sword saint, but reminds him that it's been a long time since he was in a real battle. And that's exactly why he surprises everyone by asking Lil to come along and provide full support to the two of them. Viri explains that Lil isn't just the top student at the Magic Academy, but a genuine, unrivaled genius in the institution's history. Unlike an ordinary mage who has 1 to 2,000 mana, Lil has an impressive 8,000. On top of that, she has the help of a powerful wolf spirit named Faril, which gives them full confidence that the mission will be in great hands. Hearing such lavish praise from such an important figure in the kingdom leaves Lil deeply honored. She says it's all thanks to her spirit companion, but the sage insists that her help will bring a lot of safety to the group. The sage admits that he and Ondine would like to come along, but explains that powerful monsters go into hiding at the slightest hint of too much mana nearby. After all, the magical capacity of legendary deities like the Spirit Kings easily surpasses hundreds of millions of power. Viri says the one who found the creature was a great wind spirit named Sylvestra, but that he got too close, and the monster ended up fleeing. Lil is stunned by the revelation and asks if the great divine wind entity is present there in that very moment. The sage confirms he's hiding his form nearby, and that he was able to find the monster quickly because he's omnipresent, like the breeze. Looking up at the sky, our guy thanks the wind spirit for helping little Juju. Suddenly, a gentle breeze blows against Glenn's face, and the sage translates, saying Sylvestre sent a friendly "you're welcome" to him. With everything properly explained, the young man accepts the mission for Juju, but asks if Lil is really willing to take on all the risks that come with it. But the girl tells him not to worry, assuring him she's perfectly fine with it. She reminds him that Glenn is skilled enough to actually cut through spells, and says she completely trusts in his potential. With that, the sage thanks the pair and asks if they can be ready to head out first thing the next morning. And Glenn, of course, agrees on the spot. Then, Lil says goodbye to him, saying she's going home to pack her things and get ready for tomorrow's journey. As soon as the door closes, Glenn asks his friend if the girl is really good at exploring dungeons, and the sage explains that it's part of her curriculum. The sage assures him that she can handle dungeons just as well as the two of them used to in their youth, which makes the swordsman worry about being a burden. After all, it's been 10 years since he was last in one, but Viri tells him not to worry and reveals that he's going to station Ondine nearby. The young man asks if the elf agreed to this plan, but the sage confesses that he hasn't even talked to her yet. Despite that, his friend guarantees that she'll gladly accept. Suddenly, a new gust of wind blows through the room, catching the swordsman's attention once again. Viri smiles and translates the wind spirit's message, saying that if the elf refuses, Sylvestre himself will go in her place. Our hero thanks the wind entity for its loyalty, and hearing this, it dissipates into the air. Glenn is curious and asks whether the elf, as the sage's right hand, shouldn't be busy with other important duties. The sage says he's able to delegate his tasks to keep the balance, but the young man worries if this won't cause his friend to lose his position. However, Viri assures him that would never happen, because his word as the great sage is simply absolute. However, fearing he might one day ruin the nation, he admits that he sometimes fears his own position, and the saying that absolute power corrupts, but Glenn calms him down, telling him that he isn't obligated to fix every injustice in the world, and that he's already done more than enough for the kingdom. Relieved to hear the words of his old companion, the sage smiles and thanks him from the bottom of his heart. Glenn then suggests that when his friend retires, they raise cattle together on a ranch, an idea the weary sage really likes. The young man mentions he'll need Lil's help, and the sage says this unusual partnership will be great for her. Our guy jokes that swordsmen have become weak, but Viri fires back, saying that if Glenn were healthy, even he wouldn't win. Changing the subject, the sage asks if the swordsman needs anything else for the expedition, promising to have everything ready by tomorrow. Looking over at his old scabbard hanging on the wall, Glenn replies that he'll need a basic set of tools for the dungeon. He also asks his friend to prepare a sword, saying that a warrior's true potential is only unlocked with a superior blade. Glenn knows he needs to take this hunt extremely seriously, especially for the safety and survival of his beloved Juju. And the sage, of course, agrees right away, promising he'll take care of it. Viri asks if his usual tools will do. Despite that, he assures him that equipment has advanced a lot in this time, and warns that his old companion is definitely in for a surprise. Glenn then stares at his own hand and wonders what his weakened body can really do, but he knows he has no choice but to fight for Juju. Meanwhile, atop a rocky, isolated mountain far from the kingdom, hidden among the trees of a dense forest lies the secret entrance to an ancient stone dungeon. Deep in those dark ruins, sharp claws move and a terrifying growl echoes off the walls. A monstrous demon roars with all its fury, standing as the terrible obstacle blocking the breaking of the curse that's consuming the little spirit. The next day, in the very early hours of the morning, the sage arrives at Glenn's cabin and cheerfully greets him so they can start their preparations. He mentions that he personally brought the equipment he planned out for the expedition. The sage reveals that he was eager to show him something very special. That's when he slowly draws a shiny black scabbard, revealing to the warrior the new legendary weapon forged especially for this climb. Glenn takes the weapon and is shocked by how unbelievably light it is, noticing that the translucent blade looks like a delicate work of glass. The sage explains that it's made of mithril and orichalcum, with a durability thousands of times greater than any ordinary steel. Furthermore, Viri explains that the sword absorbs mana, allowing it to cut through spells cast by extremely powerful mages, and even from deities on his or Ondine's level. The swordsman fears his worn-out body won't be able to handle such magical demands, but the sage has full confidence in his ability. To test the new weapon, the sage shows him a special steel ingot and suggests they make a practice cut. A little embarrassed, Glenn refuses, saying you shouldn't just go swinging a blade around for no reason. But his friend insists. That's when Ondine appears behind them like a psycho, demanding that the sage step away from Glenn immediately. After settling everyone down, Viri finishes explaining the uses of all the equipment, Then, Glenn points to his leg and explains that it started to glow when Juju received mana from Ondine. That's when Viri explains that even though the young man insists he has no magical affinity, great warriors also used magic, which is divided into two types. While one type manifests elements on the outside, the other works inside the body, strengthening physical power and the senses. He reveals that warriors and archers use this second type of magic specifically to sharpen their combat abilities. Undine praises the explanation, but proudly adds that Viri is basically the only mage capable of mastering this type of spell. To Glenn's surprise, the sage reveals that he used to wield an extremely superior form of physical reinforcement magic, calling him a true genius. He recalls that, even before the magic revolution, the young man possessed an absurd amount of mana and could sniff out enemies from a distance. Even hearing all of this, Glenn remains reluctant, finding it hard to believe that an ordinary warrior could ever surpass a mage. But Viri insists, assuring him that his friend was incomparably stronger than any magic user before the injury. Then, the sage decides to reveal a crucial truth about the current state of his friend's body. 2 hours pass after that long and revealing conversation. Lil finally arrives at the spot alongside her imposing four-legged companion. Before setting off, Glenn presses Viri once more about the warning from earlier, but the sage only asks him not to push himself too hard. Undine plans the route, suggesting they rent a flying creature to reach the location, and get off a bit before arriving so they don't startle the monster. Lil mentions she knows the young man has visited the stables of those creatures before, and he says he used to rent them to explore dungeons with Viri. She then looks at her huge wolf and asks whether he'll be able to ride on the back of a flying monster like that. But the girl decides it's better for the wolf to run on solid ground, since his incredible speed can easily keep pace with the creature's flight. Then, walking a bit further, the group finally spots their destination up ahead on the hill. Before them, the imposing dragon stables rise up, where various winged beasts soar through the sky. Glenn comments that the reptiles look very well cared for, and suggests they first go greet the head of the stables. As they enter, the person in charge welcomes the swordsman, saying he's already been informed of everything. Suddenly, a strong gust of wind escapes from within the stable corridor. With the beasts growling in a friendly way in their stalls, Glenn formally greets the handler and asks for his help. Politely, the handler bids good morning to the deity Ondine and to young Lil. Then, the man notices Juju in the young man's arms and comments on how cute the little spirit is. The handler advises Glenn to introduce the little one to the mounts so they don't get skittish, and Ondine decides to help him with that task. Very tenderly, the elf strokes the snout of one of the monsters. Watching this, Glenn is impressed to notice how much those creatures simply adore the elf's presence. Another wyvern approaches Juju and lets out a small roar. Seeing the peaceful interaction between them, our hero smiles as he realizes that the beasts also took a liking to Juju. The handler comes over and asks how the beasts are behaving, and Ondine confirms that all of them are behaving perfectly. The man then asks which mount they'd like to use today. At that moment, an enormous wyvern stands out from the others and roars, seeming to volunteer to carry the group on the journey. Ondine strokes him and finds out this imposing creature's name is Wing Road, the undisputed leader of all the beasts there. The handler jokes that the monster is very lucky to have been the one chosen to carry such a magnificent deity. The elf then announces that she herself will guide the mount, since she knows the exact route to the dungeon. Glenn offers to help with the preparations, but the handler stops him in a light-hearted way, reminding him that he's the guest of the day. The man tells the young man to just rest and wait for the preparations to be done. Shortly after, they take off, and the majestic creature slices through the clouds at an overwhelming speed. Eyes wide open at the vastness of the sky, little Juju becomes completely ecstatic. Glenn notices his partner's excitement and asks if she's having fun, knowing that flying on the back of a wyvern is an experience quite unlike any other. The young man mentions how much he loves that kind of speed. Concerned, Glenn asks if Faril is managing to keep up with the fast pace of the trip, to which Lil confirms. The wolf shows he's doing great, but confesses he'd love to rest a bit as soon as they arrive. Ondine explains that restoring mana also restores a spirit's physical strength, and Lil thanks her immensely for helping Faril run down below. Hours later, the group finally lands near the mountain, and the elf uses her radiant magic to restore the exhausted giant wolf's energy. Watching the flow of mana healing her companion, Lil realizes her own magical power is also increasing thanks to the strong connection between the two of them. Ondine asks how the girl is feeling, and she answers enthusiastically that she feels stronger than ever, thanking the goddess of water. Ondine donates a bit of mana to Juju and warns that she won't be able to enter the dungeon, leaving the protection of Glenn and the little one in young Lil's hands. Even so, the elf warns warns them that the enemies inside are extremely powerful and asks them to be as careful as possible in there. The swordsman thanks the goddess for her advice and assures her he'll keep every word in mind throughout the entire exploration. The group then says goodbye to the elf and continues on toward the rocky, imposing peaks of the mountain, where the creature's lair is hidden. When they arrive at an entrance carved from stone, the young ones notice that the dungeon resembles an ancient, mysterious, forgotten ruin. Glenn looks into the darkness of the corridor and comments that the inside seems pretty confusing, suggesting they sketch a map so they don't get lost. Lil then remembers to ask if the young man didn't receive any special tools from the headmaster. With that, Glenn reaches into his pockets and pulls out a portable magical device, an automatic environment mapping tool. The young man activates the handy device, which starts mapping the walls, and then pulls out a small portable magic lamp given to him by the sage. He fastens the glowing lantern to his shoulder to keep his hands free for his sword, and takes the lead of the group. Now inside, a dark, cold wind sweeps through the damp stone corridor of the ruin. Juju lets out a cute little sound, and the young man strokes her tiny head, promising he'll protect her with his life if any danger arises. Glenn asks his companion what she usually prioritizes when exploring, and Lil explains that she uses magic to detect traps and enemies. Suddenly, the young mage detects a threat. From deep in the dark corridor, 3 gigantic furious rats come charging in at high speed. Impressed by the terrifying speed of the beasts, Glenn quickly draws his sword. But before our guy even needs to make the first strike, he senses a sudden strong surge of magical energy right next to him. With total agility, Lil extends her hands and casts an elemental spell, launching sharp icicles at the monsters. The rats are impaled instantly, and after Glenn praises the spell, Lil asks Faril to burn the bodies to keep them from turning undead. The enormous wolf lets out a fierce roar and spews devastating flames onto the rats' corpses, incinerating everything to ashes in mere seconds. As they move forward, Glenn is impressed by the young girl's efficiency, noticing how precise and professional her combat instructions are. He thinks that with mages this powerful, warriors really have become obsolete. That's when he lunges forward and tells the girl to stay on guard, warning that he sensed a strange, terrifying presence hiding nearby. But since her sensors didn't pick anything up, Lil asks whether it might have been a mistake. Glenn is puzzled that not even they can pick up on that awful, unsettling tension. The young man remembers what Viri had told him about his old power of detecting enemies through physical reinforcement, even before any magic. Realizing that the mages are totally vulnerable to an ambush, he understands that he's the only one there capable of acting in a surprise attack. However, the swordsman hesitates for a brief moment, wondering if his weakened body would really be able to fight in that situation. Especially since he carries that mysterious, terrible mark on his leg, he recalls Viri's melancholic words, revealing that his physical body was actually extremely weakened and drained. The sage had asked him if he had ever found it strange that his injured leg simply wouldn't heal with any restoration spell. At that moment, his friend revealed that the serious injury was actually the result of a terrible curse. Viri apologized for having hidden it for so long, explaining that he didn't want to burden the warrior with unnecessary worries. The sage explained that his curse shared the same properties as Juju's, silently draining all of the immense mana he possessed. The warning was terrifying. If nothing was done to reverse the situation, his mana would run out completely, and he would die within a few years. Back in the reality of the corridor, the young man sighs as he accepts the fact that his body really was becoming more and more vulnerable. But looking at Juju, he swears to protect her at all costs. Suddenly, a colossal stone monster rises from the shadows right behind Lil. Wasting no time, our hero desperately shouts the young mage's name for her to get out of the way immediately. But seeing that the girl is frozen in place, he lunges forward like a bolt of lightning, and in a split second, Glenn's sword flashes through the air and blocks the monster's devastating attack. In that instant, Glenn recalls Viri explaining that before, due to their incompatibility, no spirit was able to donate mana to him. However, the situation has completely changed, since the warrior is now magically connected and bound to little Juju's soul. With the curse weakened, the sage was now able to transfer magical power to the young man directly through the little spirit. Feeling the energy and the determination to protect them all surging through him, the former sword saint rises once again. Meanwhile, on a distant hill, the goddess Ondine stands on standby. She recalls when she was at the Magic Academy, and Viri called her in for a conversation. He asked her whether the two of them had perhaps performed some kind of official pact or soul-binding contract. Ondine answered with complete certainty that they already had a bond. Even so, she found it strange, since the young man didn't know the magical contract formula, but Viri explained that connected souls don't need formulas. The sage admitted that formulas only serve ordinary people like him, and that Glenn's greatness made such formalities unnecessary. On top of that, Viri had noticed that Glenn's body was also recovering quickly from that serious injury. When the sage asked if he could really trust that dangerous incursion to the two of them, she replied with total certainty that yes, he could. And back in the current battle, Glenn blocks the violent attack of that stone beast with extreme mastery. mastery. With a swift movement of his blade, the young man manages to push the monster back, but the enemy recovers quickly, forcing Lil to take the lead and fire off her attack spell. The young mage launches a huge blast of energy straight at the creature. To everyone's shock, the monster activates a magical barrier that deflects the attack and lunges forward again, but upon locking eyes with little Juju for an instant, the beast whispers her name and simply vanishes into thin air. Glenn is completely stunned. He also notices that the energy left behind by the monster was strangely similar to that of his companion. Intrigued, he pets Juju and asks Lil if that bizarre being wasn't actually a spirit. The girl confirms this, deducing that the master left it out to keep the warrior's sword from hesitating. After all, in that era, spirits were seen as lifelong companions and even as family members. Lil then breaks the ice by thanking the young man for saving her, but she confesses, quite worriedly, that the barrier of that being was too strong for them to break. Even so, the group knows very well that defeating that creature is the only way to break Juju's curse. That's when he recalls Ondine's words, saying it wasn't mandatory to eliminate the main target. With that, he reveals that this spirit also seemed to be suffering from the same terrible curse, and he suggests that if they break the enemy's spell, they can save everyone without needing to fight. Lil thinks the idea is amazing, but asks how he was able to predict the creature's surprise attack earlier. The young man simply confesses that he just felt the intense bloodlust coming from the opponent. The young woman explains that killing intent is nothing more than a tiny, almost invisible amount of mana. With that, she concludes that Glenn has an incredible ability to read the flow and changes in energy. He considers that maybe he can't see that flaw in himself or in Juju because there's no malice in their hearts. The girl adds that a curse creates a strong distortion in the target's power, visible to those who are sensitive to it, and she assures him that if Glenn can destroy that magical distortion, the root of the curse will finally be undone. Given this, he asks whether Lil's magic or Faril's flames would be capable of achieving such a feat. Lil reminds him that, besides the barrier, they can't see the distortions. That's when the young mage looks in surprise at the sword the young man is carrying. She suggests using it to try and solve their huge problem. She explains that a blade capable of absorbing mana and cutting through powerful spells might be able to tear through the distortion. And our guy agrees on the spot. He praises the young woman's cleverness. The young man realizes that the sage Viri had already planned everything by handing him that sword. With their goal set, he says it's time to hunt down the cursed spirit, and Lil agrees immediately. However, as they advance through the ruins, a strange threatening sound echoes off the stone walls once again. He warns that he felt another wave of bloodlust, and cautions that this one is infinitely stronger than the first. Lil wonders if it's a different monster, but Glenn thinks the killing intent from the same being has just intensified. The girl agrees and clenches her fist, but suddenly, the young man extends his arm and orders the mage to stop immediately. Before them, the dark stone walls give way to a completely different scenery. Lil looks at the mapping device and finds it strange, since that enormous white wall ahead shouldn't exist. She notices that the color of the barrier is identical to the spirit's and deduces that the creature itself must have created it. Glenn then looks over at the giant wolf and asks if he could destroy that white barrier with his strength. And so the enormous wolf roars and fires a powerful ice attack straight at the blockade. A huge cloud of dust and smoke rises through the corridor after the impact. However, Lil realizes the attack failed miserably. Our guy tries to console the sad wolf, praising his strength, and soon says he's come up with a plan to get past it. If that really is a protective barrier from the cursed spirit, his new magic sword will certainly be able to slice and tear through that blockade with ease. But he knows very well that destroying a physical blockade using just an ordinary sword is far from easy. Even more so a wall that resisted the wolf's spell, but thanks to his extreme energy sense, he begins to feel the imperfect flow of mana emanating from that barrier. And he realizes that, instead of focusing on breaking the entire wall, he should aim exactly at the point where the mana is weakest. So he focuses all of his attention on that exact spot, and with incredible speed, Glenn draws his legendary sword and slices precisely through the area. Instantly, cracks begin to spread throughout the entire structure, and with a deafening crash, the magical barrier shatters completely. Lil and the giant wolf celebrate the success of the attack. However, the calm doesn't last long, as the terrible spirit monster appears out of nowhere right behind them. Lil lets out a scream. The monster attacks, but Glenn dodges just in time with Lil in his arms and asks if she's hurt. That's when Glenn notices something bizarre. He spots a kind of mysterious thread connected directly to the creature's back. Remembering that he's the only one who can see distortions, the young man decides it's time to try cutting it. Without hesitation, our hero charges straight at the enemy. The beast tries to strike him, but Glenn uses his speed to dodge yet another violent attack. With an impressive acrobatic leap, he launches himself above the monster, aiming at the thread on its back. In midair, Glenn delivers a perfect strike with his legendary sword, cutting the invisible link of the curse. The creature lets out a roar and finally falls. A little while before all of this commotion, right after Juju had been welcomed into Glenn's simple cabin, the little spirit was slowly waking up, feeling a bit confused and missing Glenn. Glenn was cooking calmly when he heard a cry coming from the bedroom. Startled, he ran over and picked the little creature up in his arms. When he realized she was just scared of being left alone, the warrior hugged her with a lot of affection. He apologized for leaving her alone and told her that breakfast was already ready. Little by little, the two of them became inseparable, and every morning began the same peaceful way. The young man fed little Juju with great care. Glenn told her to eat well, to build her strength back up, when suddenly they heard soft knocks at the front door. It was the goddess Ondine, who was already walking into the cabin and started giving Glenn a somewhat suspicious look. She glanced at the plate on the table and asked, confused, what on earth that strange thing he had prepared was. The young man explained that he had just mashed the jerky to make it easier to eat, but the elf shot back that, although it didn't look terrible, the taste was surely awful. She argued that nutrition was important, of course, but that baby food also needs to be tasty. Glenn said Juju was eating with gusto, but the elf explained that the little one had barely just been born and didn't even know what truly good food was yet. With a sad look, Ondine commented that finding that tasty was actually really pitiful for the poor spirit. She advised him to give her fruit or softened bread. Despite that, Glenn looked at the plate and made a few noises, which made Glenn ask if she still wanted to eat more of that food. Seeing this, the elf gave in and said that little Juju's happiness was the only thing that really mattered in that moment. But she immediately told the little creature that she shouldn't settle for so little, since the world was full of delicious foods. While time passed outside the humble cabin on the mountain, the little one finished licking the plate completely clean, without leaving a single scrap behind. Our guy admitted that if it were just for him, he'd eat any junk, but that for Juju, he wanted to get her the very best. Hearing this, Ondine promised to bring plenty of good food the next day. She reminded him that the academy would cover their living expenses, but the young man still felt a bit embarrassed about all that financial help. Suddenly, the little creature caught his attention with her cute little sounds. With that, he asked if she was still hungry. Wearing a small smile, Ondine offered to transfer a bit more mana to the little spirit. The elf joked that she wouldn't mind doing the household chores if they lived together, which left Glenn completely red. But in the end, the only real priority for that pair was making sure little Juju grew up strong, healthy, and very happy. So our hero gave in to whatever the elf said, except her request to move in with him. Completely disarmed by the little creature's affection, Ondine returned the hug with plenty of sweetness. Thanks to the support and affection of all those incredible people, the days of the former sword saint were once again filled with joy and peace. And back in the current battle, Glenn's legendary blade slices with absolute precision through the invisible chains sustaining the terrible curse. Under the impact of the devastating strike, the giant stone dragon cracks entirely. Finally free of the evil spell, the monster crumbles into pieces. After the battle, Glenn walks calmly back toward Lil. Lil asks what he just did, and the young man explains that he just saw a disgusting chain and decided to cut it. Right after that, a brilliant light consumes the entire shell, revealing that the true form of that spirit is about to emerge. From the middle of all that dust, the imposing head of a majestic black creature with glowing eyes emerges. Lil asks if that's really a dragon. The immense black beast rises before them. The young mage says it's the first time in her life that she's seen a spirit dragon, and Glenn agrees that it's a first for him too. At that moment, little Juju starts squirming excitedly inside the baby carrier. Noticing the little one's movements, Glenn asks if she really wants to get closer to that gigantic black creature. Worried about their safety, Lil shouts desperately, warning that the dragon might still be extremely dangerous. But without hesitating, Glenn steps closer, allowing little Juju to gently touch the enormous dragon's snout. That's when the creature focuses its immense gaze on them and whispers that it has finally been saved by the young man. Our guy is startled and asks if the creature can really speak. The beast bows and thanks the son of men, swearing it will never forget the debt it owes him for saving it. Then the dragon politely asks to know the name of its savior, to which Glenn shyly answers that it was no big deal. The young man then introduces himself as Glenn Lansbury and takes the opportunity to introduce the little and cute Juju in his arms. The dragon recognizes the name and respectfully confesses that he has one last important request to make of the young man. With all the solemnity in the world, the immense beast asks Glenn to give him a name. Glenn is surprised by the request. The beast explains that for a spirit, a name stabilizes its magical circuits and makes it far more resistant to curses. Our warrior then asks what kind of spirit he is, and the dragon apologizes for not having introduced himself sooner. To everyone's shock, he reveals himself as the elemental king of darkness, holding the same position as deities like Ondine. Stunned, Glenn asks why he still doesn't have a name, and the dragon explains that, unlike the other kings, he has almost never had contact with humans, and that's why he was never named. Glenn questions whether someone as ordinary as him can really name such a powerful being, but the beast assures him that this will help them all. The dragon reveals that this is connected to Juju and asks if he knows who she is, but the young man says Ondine has always kept the secret hidden. And so the King of Darkness decides to finally reveal Juju's true, magnificent identity. He reveals that the little creature is nothing less than the supreme leader of the Spirit Kings and the legendary Holy Dragon. Glenn and Lil panic, and the dragon warns that she's only this weak because of a monster living deep in that dungeon. He reveals that all of Juju's suffering began because of a terrible curse cast upon him in the past. Glenn is stunned to hear from the enormous reptile that this curse held a terrifyingly destructive power. The beast explains that the spell was specifically created to pass through his body and strike little Juju. He says the affliction is so strong that it affects spirits of the same rank, and reminds them that Sylvestra was nearly caught before he could escape. Since Juju is still a baby with high magical resistance, the enemies use the dragon himself as a way to curse her from a young age. The creature warns that these evil beings consider Juju a gigantic threat and will do anything to eliminate her. That's why he insists that Glenn give him a name, because only then will he become immune, and the curse will never happen again. With such a noble and important reason at stake, our hero accepts the request on the spot and decides to give his new ally a name worthy of him. The dragon promises he'll never forget such kindness from the humble swordsman. However, the young man starts sweating nervously, remembering it didn't go all that well when he had to pick Juju's name. Lil and the wolf Faril try to encourage him, telling him to do his best, but Glenn desperately begs for at least one piece of advice. Glenn asks what kind of name he'd like to have, and the beast responds that anything from him will be perfect. As long as it isn't something absurdly terrible, the dragon will gladly accept whatever choice our guy makes. After thinking for a bit, Glenn looks at the black dragon and asks what he thinks of the name Shade. The immense beast falls completely silent for a few moments. Fearing the dragon didn't like Glenn's choice, the group waits tensely for a response. Suddenly, the creature lets out a thunderous roar that makes the entire dungeon shake. Absolute darkness consumes the whole place, snuffing out even the magic lanterns. Glenn complains that he can't see a thing, but shortly after, the black mist begins to dissipate rapidly. That's when Ondine appears out of nowhere, saying she felt the curse break and came to see if everyone was all right. Just then, a small, fluffy little black dragon walks slowly toward Glenn. Glenn is startled to see the beast has shrunk so much, but the dragon explains he did it just to make it easier to talk with them. The young man asks why so much sudden power, and the little dragon apologizes, saying he got carried away and lost control. Glenn thinks it over and realizes that despite appearing imposing, his new friend is actually a real klutz. Ignoring his embarrassment, the little dragon thanks Glenn once again for his enormous generosity. He happily shouts that his name is now Shade, celebrating the fact that he received such an incredible name. Ondine asks if Glenn really was the one who gave that name to the legendary being. Shade teases the elf, saying she must be dying of jealousy, which makes her get quite grumpy. The goddess then assures them that Juju is finally safe, although her full recovery will still take some time. And to Glenn's surprise, the goddess reveals that the terrible affliction tormenting his injured leg was also undone along with it. She says that the one responsible for cursing them both belongs to the same race and used an identical spell structure for the attack. Since Glenn and Juju's souls are magically connected, freeing this little spirit instantly healed the young man's body. Changing the subject, the goddess of water looks at the black dragon and asks what his plans are from this moment of freedom on. Shade responds that he doesn't have enough words to thank the group for having rescued him from that terrible suffering in the ruins. And he says that, to repay at least a little bit of that immense debt of gratitude to the warrior, he would like to ask Glenn's permission to become his loyal servant and start fighting under the swordsman's command. Our hero panics on the spot and tries to refuse, but the little reptile insists. The dragon declares that it would be an unbearable shame to do absolutely nothing after everything the warrior has done for him. Glenn suggests a middle ground, saying he doesn't need a servant, but that he would gladly accept his help in times of danger. Shade happily agrees and solemnly swears his eternal loyalty to both the young man and his beloved leader Juju. With everything properly settled, the young man dismisses the formalities and suggests the group finally head back home. It doesn't take long for them to leave the depths of that dark, dangerous stone dungeon behind, and the black dragon prepares dares to show off his impressive speed, Shade spreads his enormous black wings and takes off masterfully, flying side by side with the group's flying mount. The proud dragon comments on how honored he feels to carry the warrior on his back. He also takes the chance to ask if little Juju is enjoying the incredible experience of flying freely through the clouds. Seeing her excitement, Shade decides to do a wild acrobatic spin in the air. Later, the group finally lands safely back in the yard of Glenn's humble wooden cabin. But Shade's joy is short-lived, as Ondine sternly scolds him for acting so childish and irresponsible. The poor little dragon lowers his head and apologizes for his terrible carelessness in the flight. Lil tries to smooth things over, saying that he's already sorry, but the elf complains that Glenn's softness only encourages this kind of behavior. Just then, Juju starts hopping, and Glenn asks if she wants to ride on Shade's back, and he accepts the invitation on the spot. Glenn shows Ondine just how much fun the little one is having with the ride. And with that, the elf ends up giving in. Suddenly, the great sage Viri enters Glenn's home. He cheerfully greets everyone. The sage looks at little Shade in admiration, praising the group for the incredible feat of breaking such a powerful curse. He reveals that Sylvestra had already sent him a full report of their success, and thanks them deeply for taking on that difficult task. Viri suggests everyone come inside to rest from the fatigue of the trip, drawing laughs from Glenn as he reminds him that this is his house. But setting that aside, the sage brings up the danger and asks if they got any more information from Shade about who cast the curse. That's when Glenn remembers that the ones responsible for attacking the spirits actually belong to the same race of deities and gods as they do. The sage explains that curses are like distorted divine miracles and starts talking about the structure of Glenn's spell. He deduces that the attackers must be religious fanatics who follow the same god, something Lil had mentioned earlier. And the worst part is that among these mysterious deities, there are those seeking the total extinction of every spirit in the world. The master admits that he still doesn't know what the real goal of these beings is, and takes the opportunity to ask a huge favor of the young swordsman. Viri reveals that there are many other innocent spirits suffering under these cruel curses spread throughout the kingdom. With that, the sage asks Glenn to join them in the difficult mission of saving these creatures. His friend warns that the journey involves immense danger, but reminds him that Glenn was able to break a spell that no cleric. Because of this legendary ability to cut through magic, Viri begs the former warrior to lend his strength to the group. Glenn smiles and tells him not to be so formal, since Ondine, Shade, and the other spirits are already companions he shares his life with. He assures him he's only alive today thanks to their help, and that this time he insists on being the one to reach out and protect them. And so, the young man accepts the call and puts himself entirely at their disposal to fight alongside his friends. The next day, after successfully breaking the curse that tormented little Juju and the powerful black dragon, Glenn wakes up slowly, feeling little Juju rubbing against his arm in a very affectionate, restless way. The young man lets out a long, sleepy yawn and asks what's going on for the little one to be so energetic this early. He wonders if she might just be really hungry after the intense battle from the day before. That's when he glances at the floor and sees little Shade lying on his back. Careful not to hurt his friend, the swordsman checks the dragon's condition and notices he's just resting. Glenn strokes Juju's head, praising her kindness for waking her owner, just because she was worried about her companion. The young man remembers that Shade played a lot with the little one right after being freed, and that even as a spirit king, he needed sleep. Watching the two of them, our hero gets lost in his own thoughts, remembering the immense tension of the battle and feeling enormous gratitude that they managed to save everyone. But the best of all is that Juju's spell has finally vanished. That's when Glenn looks at Juju's little paws and notices that her limbs seem much longer than before. In fact, the little creature is finally starting to grow and evolve thanks to the large amount of pure mana she has recovered. And to everyone's surprise, tiny little wings start sprouting from her back. The young man notices that Juju is quite hungry and figures this appetite is the first sign that her body has finally started to grow. At that same moment, the cabin door opens and the goddess Ondine walks in, wishing the young swordsman a good morning. He returns the greeting and takes the chance to ask her to take a look at Juju, since the little spirit's body has begun to change. As the day moves on and the birds sing on the cabin roof, the elf examines the little creature very carefully. Ondine confirms that Juju's limbs and tail really have grown and are much stronger. Glenn wonders if she'll become a giant dragon like Shade, but the little dragon denies it, and the elf explains that she's just returning to her original, beautiful, divine form. Shade says her wings will develop even more, just like a swan's. Changing the subject, the elf says she brought plenty of food for breakfast, since the spirit needs to eat well to recover her true form. And so, time passes peacefully through that pleasant morning. Shortly after, the meal comes to an end. With a full belly, Juju can't take the tiredness anymore and ends up drifting off to sleep, and Ondine smiles, saying that eating and sleeping well are the most important steps for the little one's recovery. But to Glenn's surprise, the elf turns to him and warns that he also needs to get plenty of rest today. The goddess insists that she'll take care of all the dishes alone. The warrior tries to hesitate and help somehow, but the elf turns completely red and firmly orders him to go lie down at once. Not wanting to argue with the water goddess, Glenn decides to give in for once and accept the well-earned rest. And in just a few minutes, he falls into a deep sleep. A soft breeze drifts in through the window, until suddenly the young man begins to wake up upon hearing a voice calling his name. Still half asleep, he opens his eyes and hears the little black dragon happily announcing that he would keep watch. To the young man's utter astonishment, Juju is walking steadily on her own little legs across the wooden floor. Glenn rushes over to her, surprised by the progress, and thanks the dragon for looking after the little one. But the loyal companion answers that it's always a great honor to help. That's when the great sage Viri sneaks in through the door, mentioning that the conversation sounded like a lot of fun. That's when Glenn calls his friend over to see that Juju can already take her first steps on her own. Viri walks in and reminds him that today's plan was to relax, and Glenn agrees, saying Ondine had already given him the exact same scolding. Then, the sage promises to take them to see a truly spectacular place that he'd been keeping a secret. But what place could that be, you ask? When they arrive at the destination, the group is left completely speechless before an enormous, magnificent hot spring hall. The place is a true paradise, perfect for everyone to finally rest their bodies and heal all their accumulated fatigue at last. Viri tells them that he and his companions are welcome to use the place whenever they want. A little awkwardly, the young man asks if anyone else needs the area, but the sage reassures his friend that it's all fine. The beautiful elf explains that they usually use that reserved space as their own private playground. She reminds him that, being divine entities, unleashing that much magical power anywhere else would be dangerous, which makes protected spots like this essential. Well, Ondine gets a bit embarrassed as she mentions that unleashing power is like a fun game for the Spirit Kings. Glenn praises the impeccable magical resistance of the walls, and the sage proudly confirms that the entire structure was heavily reinforced to withstand any impact without breaking. To prove the point, Viri fires a powerful explosive spell at the wall. The smoke clears quickly, and the sage shows with a smile that the structure didn't take a single scratch. The master reveals that Ondine provided the pure water, and Salamander heated it perfectly for the bath. Suddenly, an enormous, imposing, muscular figure emerges from the hot steam of the water, revealing himself to be the legendary elemental king of Earth, Gnome. The stone giant greets the swordsman happily, saying it's been a long time, and the young man responds enthusiastically that he's heard a lot about him. Gnome brings his gaze closer to the young man's arms, respectfully recognizing the presence of little Juju. The stone giant introduces himself as the elemental king of Earth and shows off his ability to turn his body into mud and control it freely. With a huge smile, Gnome confesses he prepared the bath with a lot of enthusiasm as soon as he heard they were coming, promising that the waters will help a lot in Juju's healing. In the changing room, Glenn comments that it's the first time he's taking a bath with Juju, but he gets a huge shock when he turns around and comes face to face with Ondine taking off her clothes right behind him. Completely panicked, Glenn asks if she really plans to get into the water with him. He tries to explain that, in human customs, men and women don't bathe together, but the elf simply counters that she's just a spirit and doesn't follow those rules. She even offers to wash his back and calls him selfish for making a beautiful lady leave. After the small misunderstanding, peace and silence finally return to the wonderful facilities of the Academy's magical hot springs. Floating in the warm water, little Juju closes her tiny eyes and enjoys every second of that revitalizing sensation. Our hero pets the little one and tenderly asks if she feels any discomfort in the little wings or in the limbs that have started to grow. Glenn touches Juju's tiny wings and thinks they're still too small for her to fly with, but he knows it's only a matter of time until she's fully grown. That's when Gnome resurfaces from the muddy waters and explains that Juju's little body ended up extremely shrunken and weak from the terrible effects of that severe curse. He details that with the flow of blood and magic newly restored, the extremities are prone to seizing up, making a vigorous massage extremely effective for recovery. The earth giant decides to help and sprouts multiple arms of mud directly from his own body. With extreme delicacy, the many mud arms begin gently massaging Juju's entire body, and she seems to love every second of the therapeutic treatment. Seeing little Juju so relaxed, Glenn smiles and thanks the stone giant, who assures him that the supreme leader's well-being is his highest priority. Gnome then looks at the young man and says he should also take the chance to take care of himself and relax his body. The giant praises the young man's heroic efforts to save the spirits and reminds him that, having just been freed from the curse in his leg, he isn't at full strength yet. Gnome advises Glenn to dive deep into the hot spring waters so the healing power can fully restore his health and physical vigor. Agreeing with his stone friend's wise advice, our guy smiles from ear to ear and decides to make the most of the moment to truly relax. Sometime later, the afternoon begins to fall over the beautiful, imposing bathhouse building of the prestigious Magic Academy. Already dressed and sitting on the bench outside, the swordsman sincerely thanks Viri for the invitation, and the great sage smiles warmly, Taking advantage of the calm moment, Viri brings up the mission and asks if there's been any progress regarding the investigation into the cursed spirits. The sage reveals they're still digging deep into the origin of it all, but confirms that the damage caused by the curses is real and worrying. He warns him that he'll definitely need Glenn's strong arm as the search progresses, and the young man readily accepts, promising he's fully available to help. Even so, he tries to understand the dark motive behind people dedicating themselves to casting such cruel curses on defenseless spiritual creatures. That's when Viri reveals that the enemies seem to seek the total extinction of the spirits, and Glenn deduces that using curses must be the most effective method they've found to act. Ondine adds that the villain's goal is probably to forcibly dominate these powerful entities to use them as weapons of war on a large scale. The sage explains that, normally, spirits only agree to make contracts with humans they recognize, but that someone has discovered a terrible way to enslave them under command. Glenn asks if this absolute, forced control is done specifically through the use of those terrible curses, to which the water goddess confirms. Shade adds that if the enemies can't dominate the stronger spirits by this method, they simply use the curse to weaken them until death. The sage confesses that, even as a genius mage, he still doesn't understand the theory behind dominating spirits with curses, and that discovering the identity of the creator god would help a great deal. He admits that gods are difficult to understand, and that thinking about them is pointless, but he assures him that he'll keep investigating, even if it's a nearly impossible task. Glenn understands the situation and realizes that if he himself takes on the task of saving the creatures, he'll give his childhood friend much more free time to focus on his research. And so, the former sword saint declares that he'll personally handle all combat matters. Meanwhile, in a dense forest far from there, the silence of nature is broken by a sinister presence lurking about. Suddenly, a huge, devastating explosion of dark magical energy destroys everything around it, opening a gigantic crater in the middle of the forest. In the middle of the dust cloud, the spoiled young noble from the beginning of the story starts cackling in a sickening way. The boy was completely fascinated by the new forbidden power he had just managed to obtain. He grits his teeth and swears that, with that colossal power, that damned swordsman who humiliated him in the past won't have the slightest chance of survival. The coward vows to make the former sword saint bitterly regret ever daring to insult him, and to challenge the nobility of the kingdom. The next day, after the entire team's well-deserved long rest, the sun's rays warmly light up Glenn's wooden cabin. With the table already cleared after breakfast, Glenn proposes resuming his physical training, since he predicts that the battles against the curses are only going to increase from now on. However, Ondine cuts him off firmly with a loud no, warning that since he's just been freed from the curse in his leg, he needs to avoid any heavy physical effort. Shade agrees, reminding him that the young man is human and not a spirit. Suddenly, little Juju starts scratching at the door, eager to go play. Glenn looks at the water goddess and asks if they can head out for a bit, and the elf ends up giving in. And so, with permission granted, the group decides that the perfect plan for today is to take a nice, calm stroll through the nearby city. Glenn puts on his usual travel outfit and secures Juju in the baby carrier, worried that Shade's dragon form will draw a lot of unwanted attention in the city. But to the warrior's surprise, Shade dissolves his body into a black magical mist, revealing that he can also completely hide his physical presence. Glenn asks Ondine how he's able to perfectly sense where the little dragon is hiding, even when he's concealing his magical presence. He's puzzled that he can't sense the other spirits in the same way, and the elf explains that this is because Shade is now his contracted spirit. Ondine reveals that, at the exact moment the swordsman gave the creature a name deep in the dungeon, the soul contract was officially completed. Glenn asks if simply choosing a name really was enough to seal such a powerful, eternal magical bond. He remembers complex rituals from the past that used magic circles and spells. But the goddess explains that, because Glenn is someone so special, the process works directly. The young man decides not to rack his brain over the complex magical details, but he's stunned to learn that the spiritual contract with Juju has also already been sealed the same way. Shortly after, the group arrives at the vibrant central plaza of the city, where several children are running and playing freely under the afternoon sun. Glenn points to the grass and explains to the little one that this place is a public park, where people usually gather to have fun and relax together. Suddenly, a child heads toward Glenn with wide-open eyes. The little blonde boy points at Juju and asks who that exotic little creature in his arms is. The young man kindly answers that this is a young baby spirit. Behind the boy, the imposing bodyguard slaps his hand against his armor in a solemn gesture of respect. Glenn notices the luxurious details of the clothes and the presence of the strong protector, figuring that the child definitely belongs to a high-status noble family. With a cheerful smile on his face, the little noble looks at the warrior and eagerly asks what the adorable spirit creature's name is. Glenn warmly answers that her name is Juju. Our hero smiles and tells her that the little boy just wants to be her friend. The boy asks if he can pet her, and Glenn crouches down to ask Juju what she thinks of the the idea. The young man tells the little noble that she happily accepted the affection. All cheerful, the little boy starts petting Juju's tiny head, praising her for being such a good girl. And the little one just seems to love the head pats. Watching that peaceful scene fills Glenn's heart with genuine happiness. Shortly after, the boy waves goodbye cheerfully, and Glenn asks his companion if she enjoyed the experience. The young man concludes that bringing her was the right choice to show her that not everyone is bad. But suddenly his combat instincts go off. At that same moment, an enormous ice spike bursts out of the ground with a thunderous crash. Acting purely on reflex, Glenn leaps nimbly backward, shielding Juju with his own body. As people run in panic, the warrior stares at the huge block of ice and realizes it was a magical attack. He grits his teeth, remembering Viri's warning about the enemies hunting little Juju. Sensing the danger, a dark mist begins to emanate from his arm, revealing that Shade is ready to intervene. But the young man quickly reaches out his hand to hold back the young black dragon's impatience. Glenn tells him to stay hidden, since keeping him a secret would be an excellent ace up his sleeve against whoever this is. Understanding his master's plan, the little dragon pulls his energy back and returns to hiding in the darkness. Taking a few steps forward, the swordsman shouts into the middle of the dust cloud, demanding that the coward stop hiding and show himself. A mysterious voice sneers, calling the young man a lucky old man. And from the shadows, that very same spoiled noble from the academy that he had humiliated in the past for mistreating Juju appears. Noticing the difference, the young man comments that his magic has improved a lot, and asks if he used sorcery to conceal himself. But the villain doesn't answer a thing. The magical pressure emanating from the young man is absurd, which makes Glenn find it strange that a simple student could have that much power. To his shock, a hideous creature comes crawling right up next to the noble's feet. Glenn is confused and asks why he is accompanied by such a spiritual being. With total arrogance, the boy lets out a laugh and says that an idiot like Glenn would never understand. Seeing the enemy's immense power, Glenn starts to suspect that the rich kid somehow managed to seal a spiritual contract, which makes no sense at all, since Ondine had made it very clear that this student had been banned from making pacts forever. Glenn quickly notices that this poor creature also carries the same curse that Shade had. Just then, he remembers Ondine's warning. Someone had finally discovered a terrible way to force and dominate spirits against their will. Glenn asks if he enslaved the spirit and who taught him to do this, but the noble says he won't tell him a thing. The boy kicks the creature and screams that this isn't a contract, but that he simply turned that piece of trash into his personal slave. Glenn laments that the noble is still the same piece of garbage as before, but the boy tells him to keep talking all he wants before he dies. Out of patience, the bully stomps on his own creature and screams for the slave to attack and finish off the swordsman once and for all. Then the noble sends a barrage of sharp ice spikes flying at Glenn. But with impeccable composure, Glenn draws his magic blade and deflects the first attack without taking a single scratch. In a sequence of perfect rapid cuts, he continues slicing every ice projectile that hurtles toward him. With the shards of ice falling around him, the former sword saint stands firm, without even shifting from his spot. Glenn notices that his reflexes are sharp and that his weakened body now moves incredibly lightly. Backing away, the boy calls the warrior a monster. He panics as he realizes that his full power had no effect at all. The young man remembers the mysterious hooded men who gave him that power, and questions why he was still so weak. Radiating a terrifying presence, Glenn begins walking slowly toward him. Desperate, the boy orders his spirit to hurry up and kill the warrior once and for all. The creature fires more energy, but Glenn easily dodges. That's when the guard and the little girl from before come running over, worriedly asking if Juju is all right, and that was the opening he needed, because the noble flashes a wicked smile and decides to aim his attack at them. The villain unleashes a huge blast of magical energy directly at the civilians. Knowing the ordinary guard won't be able to withstand that destructive force, Glenn charges toward them. The attack strikes the spot with full force, kicking up a huge cloud of smoke. However, the noble's eyes widen as he realizes that his powerful spell has been completely nullified in midair. From within the smoke, a gigantic black wing emerges, blocking the strike, while an imposing voice warns that the boy has gone too far. The smoke clears, and reveals that Shade has taken on his imposing black dragon form to serve as a protective shield. The villain flies into absolute panic when he comes face to face with this legendary creature, but before he can take a single step to flee, Glenn appears right behind him like a ghost. Without giving him any chance to react, our hero lands a precise blow to the back of the boy's neck, knocking him out instantly. Glenn thanks Shade for the excellent support with the defense, but the loyal dragon responds that there's no need for formalities between them. Our guy asks the guard to keep protecting the little girl, and he quickly hugs her. With the situation under control, Glenn turns toward the last problem. Looking at the poor reptile, he knows very well that he also needs to save that spirit from the curse. The creature is suffering greatly from the terrible effects of the spell. Glenn walks over to the guard and the little girl, asking if the two of them made it through all that chaos unharmed. The soldier thanks the warrior and his spirit immensely for their help. The young man asks Shade Shade to stay on high alert nearby, and the Darkness Dragon agrees immediately. With that said, our hero focuses entirely on the little reptile. The creature doesn't show any hostile intent, seeming just like a helpless little thing begging for help. Glenn crouches down and asks Shade if it's possible to break the pact, but the dragon warns that undoing a bond without consent is nearly impossible. He explains that it would take an extremely complex ritual for third parties to interfere, something not feasible for anyone who doesn't master magic. Glenn slowly reaches out toward him, assuring him he won't do him any harm. Upon touching him, he notices that the creature has no visible physical wounds, which proves that the curse is overwhelming its energy. Feeling the gentle touch on its back, the creature curls up a little. That's when Juju hops out of Glenn's baby carrier. Without any fear at all, the little one walks up and gently presses her snout against the reptile's snout. Glenn wonders if Juju might be feeling empathy for the pain of her fellow spirit. Suddenly, the creature raises its head and lets out a sharp cry. Startled by the reaction, the young man tries to understand what's happening. Glenn notices that their voices are in perfect harmony, as if they're resonating with the same magical energy. With that, brilliant, sinister chains begin to appear around the little creature's body. He's amazed to now be able to see the presence of the curse so clearly, something that was impossible to see before. Glenn remembers that Lil mentioned it was possible to see the distortions of someone who is cursed, and deduces that Juju's resonance revealed the spell. With the evil bond exposed before his eyes, Glenn knows he has no time to waste and shouts for Juju to keep maintaining that strong connection with the spirit. With an extremely precise strike, Glenn brings down his mithril blade and cuts the chains of the curse perfectly in half. Now free from the spell, the little reptile collapses onto the grass. Shade asks if the swordsman was able to see the curse, and Glenn answers that it was probably thanks to Juju's help. But before they can go on, the creature begins melting into the ground in a bizarre way. Suddenly, a soft voice appears, touching Glenn and assuring him that the spirit is just returning to its original form. Glenn gets a huge fright and is left speechless when he realizes that the goddess Ondine has just appeared right next to him. A bit flustered by the elf's excessive closeness, the young man mentions somewhat awkwardly that she's standing way too close to him. Ondine innocently asks if she's being annoying or a bother. Well, Glenn can barely move with the water goddess pressing her body against his. Noticing his embarrassment, she pulls back a little from him. Changing the subject, Ondine points to the grass and asks what they should do now with the little spirit. She asks the young man to protect them for the time being, but Glenn questions whether the evil contract with the noble is still active. The water goddess calms him down, explaining with total certainty that the boy never actually made a real contract with the beast. She reveals that the former student was simply forcing the creature's obedience through the cruel use of curses. Glenn clenches his teeth in anger as he realizes just how despicable the boy's actions were. The young man turns to the guard and asks if he can handle the noble, to which the soldier readily agrees. At that very moment, the troublemaker starts coming back to his senses. He tries to prop himself up on the grass and notices an enormous shining shadow looming directly above him. When he looks up, he comes face to face with Ondine, glowing intensely with her divine aura and dominating the entire space around her. The elf warns that this is the second time he's committed this crime and that he won't get away with it. Even so, the arrogant boy shouts that spirits are slaves and that he can do whatever he wants with them. Ondine then declares with total disdain that she will no longer forgive such cruel words. Furious at being confronted, the boy shouts at her to shut up and tries to cast one last attack spell, but with a single motion, the goddess nullifies his magic instantly. The coward collapses again, and soon the little girl runs cheerfully toward the elf. Ondine flashes a gentle smile and greets the little girl with affection. Glenn wonders if that little one really is just an ordinary noble's daughter. With great tenderness, the elf strokes the top of the little girl's head and asks if she ended up getting hurt. The little girl answers with a bright smile that she's doing great and didn't get hurt at all during the whole ordeal. She hugs Shade's neck tightly, cheerfully celebrating that the knights and the great black dragon protected her so well. Ondine then praises Shade's good work. The guard walks up to the water goddess and asks if the danger has finally passed, and she confirms there are no more threats nearby. Relieved by the deity's answer, the soldier thanks her for her help and apologizes for having caused so much trouble. Then, he walks toward Glenn, determined to give his sincere thanks to the skilled swordsman. The little girl also walks over and thanks Glenn enthusiastically. The girl notices the little being and asks if Juju is all right and whether she ended up getting hurt. But in the young man's arms, the melting little creature is resting. Ondine assures the little girl that the little spirit is out of danger now and that he will soon make a full recovery. The little girl politely asks if she can pet the creature, and the kind elf allows it as long as she's gentle. Very affectionately, the child runs her hand over the little spirit's head, sweetly wishing him a quick recovery. Glenn looks at the elf and discreetly asks which important family this adorable little girl really belongs to, but he quickly changes changes his mind and thinks that the most important thing right now is to focus on ensuring the spirit's safety. The young man then turns to Shade and asks if the loyal Black Darkness dragon could carry the little spirit home. Always very helpful and proud, Shade guarantees on the spot that carrying out that task is his greatest duty as a companion. And so, with the dust finally settling in the plaza, the day begins to give way to late afternoon in the peaceful city of the kingdom. Back at the cabin, Juju pets the top of her new gelatinous friend's head. Glenn watches the two of them sleeping peacefully and decides that the first step now is to give the little creature a good bath. Ondine explains that the white slime covering the spirit's body is harmful and advises washing him with warm water very slowly. He prepares a wooden basin with warm, clean water. With great gentleness, the young man starts bathing the gelatinous little creature, scrubbing carefully so as not to hurt him. But noticing that the grime is really hard to get off, he asks Juju if it wouldn't be better to use a bit of special soap. Glenn remembers that Ondine had given him a soap made by Viri last time, excellent for cleaning heavy grime without being harsh. A little while later, Glenn is thrilled to see that the sage soap is extremely effective. Well, the little gelatinous spirit seems to enjoy every second of that lovely bath. But Glenn gets worried when he notices that he keeps sleeping deeply and figures that the exhaustion from the curse was just too much.